Looks like a lot of people were right to wait. A while back, when Lords of the Fallen 2 got announced with Epic involved, I remember a ton of people in the comments immediately saying the same thing. They weren't buying it if it stayed locked to Epic. Some people said they'd wait for Steam. Lots of you even said you skip it entirely. And honestly, it became one of the biggest talking points around the game almost immediately. Which is kind of crazy when you think about it, considering people should have been talking about the actual sequel itself. At the time though, I remember saying this whole thing felt less like Cygames desperately wanting exclusivity forever and more like a studio that probably needed financial backing during a rough period. Well, looks like that may have been exactly what happened. Cygames just released a major publishing update for Lords of the Fallen 2, and it completely changes the PC situation around the game. This whole thing actually says quite a bit about the current state of game development, publishing deals, and just how expensive it's become for AA studios to survive right now. So let's go through the statement piece by piece because some sections here are way more important than they first seem. So looking at this first part, independent developer Cygames today announced that it has signed a separation agreement with Epic Games Publishing. As a result, Cygames has regained full open distribution rights for the PC version of Lords of the Fallen 2, moving away from the previous PC exclusive publishing arrangement signed in June 2024. This is the part most PC players immediately cared about the second they saw the announcement. What this basically means is that Lords of the Fallen 2 is no longer tied to the original Epic exclusive publishing setup people were worried about last year. Cygames now controls open distribution again, which means the game can launch across every single storefront instead of just being locked to one ecosystem. And yeah, whether some people like hearing it or not, storefront choice genuinely matters to a huge part of the PC audience. There are players who simply do not buy Epic exclusives. Some people dislike the launcher, well, I'd say most people, but some prefer having everything on Steam, some want Steam features, community tools, workshop support, achievements, reviews, whatever the reason is. The point is, exclusivity absolutely affects perception on PC, especially for a game like Lords of the Fallen 2. This isn't Call of Duty where people are going to buy it no matter what launcher it appears on. This is still a Souls-like from a AA studio trying to grow its audience long term, so limiting storefront visibility was always going to make people nervous. I think this is big news because this will definitely help the game massively before launch. The Steam visibility alone is huge. Wishlists definitely matter. Community engagement matters. Player population matters even more in games with co-op systems and online features. So from a player perspective, this is probably the best possible outcome. But then the next section of the statement starts explaining why Epic was involved in the first place. And that part is actually way more interesting than the exclusivity drama itself. Let's continue. Lords of the Fallen 2 remains scheduled to launch later this year on PC via Epic Game Store and other PC storefronts, as well as on the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and S. Cygames will self-publish the title across all platforms, while PlayOn continues as the global physical distribution partner. Now, this is where the announcement becomes much bigger than just not Epic exclusive anymore. Cygames is now self-publishing the game across every platform, so this is a pretty major shift. Self-publishing means they're taking back control over distribution, their presence, their marketing decisions, and how the game is handled commercially moving forward. That usually only happens when a studio feels confident enough financially to manage things themselves again. That's probably a really good sign for where the project is at internally. If this statement had come out sounding messy or hostile, I'd probably be a bit more worried. But this whole thing reads more like a studio that got the support it needed during development and now feels stable enough to move forward independently. The other important part here is that Epic still hasn't disappeared from the picture entirely. The game is still launching on the Epic Game Store. This isn't some dramatic breakup where both sides are throwing chairs at each other on the way out. It sounds more like the exclusivity arrangement ended while the overall relationship stayed intact. And from a business perspective, that honestly makes a lot of sense. Epic still gets the game on their platform, Cygames gets broader distribution, and us, the players, can finally choose where we play it. Everybody kind of walks away with something here. The PlayOn mention is interesting too, even if most people probably skipped over it. Keeping a major physical distribution partner involved tells me Cygames still wants this launch to feel bigger than just another digital-only AA release buried on storefronts. They clearly want Lords of the Fallen 2 positioned as a major release this time around. Then the statement moves into the tech side of the partnership, which is where things get even more interesting. Cygames will continue to utilize Epic's technologies, including Unreal Engine 5 and Epic Online services, powering cross-platform play, matchmaking friends lists, and seamless shared progression co-op. All that stuff. Now, this part is important because it immediately kills the idea that Cygames is trying to distance itself from Epic. They're definitely not. I mean, Epic is still deeply tied into the actual technology behind the game. Unreal Engine 5 obviously makes sense since a huge percentage of modern games are using it now, especially a lot of AA and AAA projects, even though we've seen a lot of problems with Unreal Engine 5 games recently. But looking at Epic Online services, that part's probably really important as well, because that means that cross-play systems, matchmaking, shared progression, friend systems, all of that infrastructure is still being powered through Epic tech, even after the publishing separation. And this is probably the best outcome, technically speaking, of course. I mean, a lot of people only think about storefronts when they hear the word Epic, but Epic also provides back-end systems that are genuinely useful for developers, especially studios that don't have the resources to build massive online infrastructure completely from scratch. And for a game like Lords of the Fallen 2, that stuff tends to matter a lot. The original game leaned heavily into co-op and online interaction, and if they're expanding that even further this time around, stable matchmaking and seamless cross-platform functionality become incredibly important, especially nowadays where people expect cross-play almost automatically. So even though the exclusivity arrangement is gone, the actual partnership clearly still exists underneath everything. So Cygames basically gets to keep the technical advantages of working with Epic while also gaining the PC distribution. But then we look at the next section, which is a bit more revealing about the entire announcement, because Cygames finally talks openly about why they partnered with Epic in the first place. Like many in the industry, Cygames faced challenging market conditions in 2023 and 2024, and Epic Games provided significant funding and strategic support that helped ensure Lords of the Fallen 2 could fully realize its ambitions. And well, here you go. Modern game development is getting ridiculously expensive, especially for AA studios trying to make games that visually compare and compete with AAA releases. Lords of the Fallen isn't some tiny indie project anymore. The first game already had massive environments, co-op systems, the whole Unreal Engine tech, online functionality, high-end visuals. All of that costs an absurd amount of money to build and maintain. And people forget that the original Lords reboot had a rough launch period too. The game improved a lot over time through updates, performance patches, balancing, content, and feedback integration, but those kinds of post-launch recoveries cost money too. A studio in that position probably doesn't turn down major financial backing very easily. So looking at the statement now, this sounds much less like Cygames trying to force players onto one launcher forever and more like a studio that really needed support during a difficult period. And honestly, Epic has been doing this more and more lately. A lot of people focus entirely on exclusivity, but Epic has quietly funded a huge number of projects behind the scenes over the last few years. Sometimes that works out well, and sometimes players hate the exclusivity side of it, but the funding itself is still very real. Without deals like this, some games probably get scaled down dramatically, or don't happen at all. That doesn't automatically mean players have to like it, obviously, but people are still going to prefer having freedom of choice on PC. I do think the statement gives way more context than people had before. And then the next paragraph goes even further into how much Epic apparently helped shape the sequel itself. This partnership enabled Cygames to meaningfully expand upon community feedback from the original Lords of the Fallen, while substantially advancing the sequel across gameplay, technical performance, world design, and online functionality. Now, one of the biggest criticisms surrounding the first Lords reboot was always that people saw potential in it, but also felt like parts of the game needed more polish, better balancing, smoother performance, and stronger overall refinement. And according to Cygames, Epic's funding basically gave them room to go bigger with the sequel in all those areas. We're talking about gameplay and technical improvements, improvements to online systems, world design, performance. I mean, that's not a small list. Now, obviously, every studio says their sequel is bigger and better, so we'll have to see how much of that actually shows up when people finally get their hands on the game. But this at least explains why Cygames seems surprisingly positive about Epic throughout the entire statement. Then we got the CEO to chime in on it himself. Epic was there for Cygames exactly when we needed them most. Their support and belief in the project made a real difference, and for that we are truly grateful. What stands out to me here is how respectful this whole announcement sounds. I mean, there's no weird corporate passive-aggressive language or vague distancing. No awkward legal sounding PR spins. This genuinely reads like a studio saying they got help when they were down and almost out from the look of things. And whether people love or hate Epic, well, most people hate it, that kind of support clearly mattered for this project. Then Marek Tymiński follows it up with this. Epic has been an outstanding supporter of Lords of the Fallen 2. With Unreal Engine 5 and the rest of Epic's world-class technologies, we're going to ship a performance game in a massive world that players can explore together across PC and console. And again, they're trying to reinforce the same thing. The exclusivity deal may be ending, but the actual partnership clearly isn't. Cygames seems heavily invested in Epic's tech ecosystem moving forward, especially regarding online functionality and cross-platform support. And this all makes sense if the sequel is pushing co-op and online systems even harder this time around. Now we get to the final line of the statement, which kind of wraps the entire situation up in one sentence. With the new agreement now in place, Lords of the Fallen 2 will launch with open PC distribution on day one, including the Epic Games Store. And that right there is basically the final answer to the whole situation. Open PC distribution. This means the game is no longer locked onto the Epic Games Store, while still playing on Epic at launch. So instead of one side completely winning and the other completely losing, this feels more like both companies found a good middle ground that made sense financially and commercially. It looks like Cygames definitely won on this round because they still got the funding and technical support they needed during development, while Epic still keeps the game on their platform and continues providing back-end technology. And we, the players, finally get to choose. That's a pretty clean resolution overall. And from a player perspective, this probably removes one of the biggest distractions surrounding the sequel before launch. For months, a huge part of the conversation around Lords of the Fallen 2 wasn't even about gameplay or improvements or combat systems, it was the whole launcher drama. Now people can actually focus on the game again. And for Cygames, that's probably a massive win heading into release, especially since most PC players play on Steam nowadays. So after reading through the full statement, I think the whole situation makes a lot more sense now than it did when the original Epic deal was first announced. Back then, a lot of people thought Cygames was just being greedy, chasing that money and locking the sequel away from Steam players for no reason. But looking at this now, it sounds much more like a studio just trying to survive. And considering how expensive modern game development has become, especially for these types of studios, trying to compete with these huge AAA studios like Ubisoft, it's not hard to see why these deals tend to happen. The important part is that I was right. No, joking. But the important part is that Cygames eventually regained the distribution control while still keeping the technical partnership with Epic intact. And I do think this changes the conversation around the game moving forward. Before this announcement, a huge amount of discussion around the game just revolved around launcher arguments instead of the game itself. Now people can finally focus on what's important, looking at combat systems, looking at environments, the worlds, the RPG systems themselves, what improvements to graphics they've had or haven't had, co-op systems, the online systems. I just hope there's no weird lag anymore when playing. If the sequel launches in a much stronger state from day one, there's definitely potential here for it to land a lot better this time around, especially now that one of the biggest sticking points for PC players is out of the way. So yeah, after reading through this whole statements, I'm glad they finally reached this agreement. I think a lot of us were waiting for this to happen. That about covers the whole situation for now, but I'm still really curious as to what people think about this one, especially anyone who completely wrote the game off once the Epic exclusivity news first dropped. Does this change your opinion at all, or were you planning to play it anyway? Also, I'd be interested to know where people land on Epic deals in general now. A lot of studios clearly need the funding, but at the same time, PC players obviously care a lot about storefront choice. Feels like this whole situation ended up being a pretty interesting middle ground. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel a lot. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Through light, paths, through shadow, I will walk them with you, wherever